Welcome to Whispers of Asia, where forgotten legends still whisper through the trees, and the past never truly dies. Across Asia, there are stories people fear to speak aloud. Cursed places, unseen watchers, spirits that were never laid to rest. Tonight, we take you deep into the northern hills of Thailand, into a quiet village where the soil is dry, the silence is heavy, and a circle of withered banana trees marks a grave no one dares disturb. 100 years ago, a girl was accused of sorcery during a time of famine. Her punishment? Buried standing, her eyes sewn open so her spirit would never sleep, her body bound in red thread to anchor her to the earth, so she could watch the village forever from beneath the ground. And now, every time the drought returns, she awakens. Muddy footprints appear on ceilings. Children stand motionless, whispering in languages no one understands. And those who dream feel like they're being watched from below. Every few decades, the red thread rises like roots from the cursed earth. And if you touch it, even by accident, she begins to use your body at night. You wake up in corners, standing still, eyes wide open, speaking in a voice that isn't yours. They buried her standing, so she could return walking. Are you ready? Tonight's story is called The Girl Who Was Buried Standing. But remember, if you feel something brush your feet while listening, don't look down, because maybe she's looking up. The first night was silent, too silent for a village that breathed. No dogs barking, no insects humming, no wind between the banana leaves. Just the heavy stillness of a place that had forgotten how to speak. The Jirasuk family arrived at dusk, their pickup truck rattling down the cracked dirt path that wound its way between parched rice fields and old wooden homes on stilts. The sun was a blood-orange coin sinking behind the hills, casting long shadows that clung to the trees like ghosts, reluctant to leave. "Strange," said Arun, the father, as he helped unload the suitcases. "It's so quiet. No birds?" His wife, Molly, didn't answer. She was staring at the 7 banana trees at the edge of the property. Their trunks were gray and twisted, their leaves dry and curled. But what disturbed her most was their arrangement, a perfect circle, as if something was being fenced in or kept out. "Where are the villagers?" she whispered. Arun shrugged. "Probably inside, it's almost dark." Their daughter Lynn, only 6 years old, didn't seem to care. She ran straight into the raised house, laughing and calling for her new room. Her voice echoed strangely in the wooden beams, as though something deeper was replying in a voice only she could hear. That night, as they settled into the unfamiliar creaks and sighs of the old home, the heat sat heavy in the air. There was no breeze, no relief, only the low hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional crackle of dry bamboo. Lynn fell asleep first, then Molly, then Arun, and then something moved. At 2:47 a.m., Molly sat upright, not fully awake, not fully asleep, just aware. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of moonlight slipping through the slats of the wooden window. She didn't know why she'd woken up. There was no sound, no in pain, no dream she could remember. Just a chill. Not on her skin, but in her bones. Then she heard the drip, Soft, slow, steady. Water? No, it hadn't rained in weeks. The drought had tightened its grip on the land like a closed fist. She got out of bed, her feet brushing against the warm wood of the floor. The drip continued, a wet, sticky sound. Not quite water, not quite blood, something in between. She followed it, step by step, through the hallway, past Lynn's closed door. And then she looked up and screamed. Because on the ceiling, directly above her, were footprints. Human, bare, muddy, facing the wrong way, as if someone had walked across the ceiling, as if someone was still up there, standing upside down. Arun ran from the bedroom. "Molly, what's wrong?" She pointed, trembling. He looked up. The footprints were still wet, still dripping, still fresh. But there was no one above them. No one in the attic, no break-in, no rational explanation. Only the 7 prints, in a perfect line, leading to a spot right above Lynn's room. They burst in together. The little girl was sitting on her bed, wide awake, staring at the wall. "Lynn," Molly called. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were open, but unfocused. Her body perfectly still. And her lips were moving. Slowly, silently, whispering something neither parent could hear. Arun knelt beside her. "Lynn, what are you saying?" Then she stopped. She turned her head slowly, like a doll with rusty joints, and smiled. A strange, too wide smile that did not belong on a child's face. "It's okay, Papa," she said. "I was just listening." Arun's voice was tight. "Listening to what?" "To the girl under the house," Lynn said. "She said she likes you." By morning, the footprints had dried and faded. No trace of mud, no residue, just wood, bare and innocent, as if nothing had happened. But Molly wasn't convinced. She swept the ceiling, scrubbed it, inspected every inch. Nothing. She asked Arun to check the attic again. He did. It was empty. No animals, no leaks, no people. Still, something had changed in the air of the house. It no longer felt abandoned. It felt inhabited, like the walls had started breathing again. And Lynn, she was back to her usual self, laughing, drawing, humming little cartoons from cartoons. But every now and then, Molly would catch her standing completely still, facing the wall, whispering to no one. Sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes longer. She always said the same thing when asked. "I'm not talking, Mama. I'm just listening." Later that day, Arun decided to ask the village elder, an old man named Prawichai, about the trees. The old monk's hut sat near the edge of the village under a massive tamarind tree. He was brewing tea when Arun approached, bowing respectfully. "You live near the circle," Prawichai said, before Arun even spoke. Arun paused. "Yes." The old man poured 2 cups. "I wondered who would be foolish enough to stay there." "What are those trees?" Arun asked. "Why are they planted like that?" "They weren't planted," Prawichai said, voice low. "They grew on their own, in that exact formation, after the girl was buried." Arun blinked. "What girl?" Prawichai stared at him. "You really don't know?" Arun shook his head. "Please tell me." The old man leaned in. She was buried standing, he whispered. Eyes shown open, bound in red thread, so she could watch the village forever. Arun laughed nervously. That's just a story, right? Prawichai didn't smile. She watches when the drought returns, he said. She whispers to children, walks ceilings, rises through dreams. He handed Arun a bundle of dried herbs wrapped in thin cloth. Hang this above your door and tell your daughter, he paused, never touch the red thread. Arun hesitated. What red thread? The monk simply looked toward the fields, toward the circle of banana trees, toward the earth that hadn't been tilled in 100 years. You'll know it when you see it, he said. That night, Arun hung the herbs. He didn't believe in curses. He didn't believe in ghosts. But when Lin smiled at him before bed, too calm, too knowing, he felt something old stir in his chest, a fear he couldn't name. At 3:13 a.m., Arun woke up, standing, facing the corner of the room, eyes wide open, whispering in a voice that wasn't his. The next morning was hotter, the kind of heat that didn't come from the sun, but from the ground, as if the earth itself was exhaling something heavy, ancient, and unseen. Molly stepped out early, hoping to gather her thoughts before Lin awoke, but instead her eyes were drawn once again to the trees, the 7 banana trees, standing in that same perfect circle at the far edge of the yard. They hadn't moved, but something had changed. The air around them shimmered faintly, like heat waves on asphalt, and the silence felt louder near them. She took a hesitant step forward. The dry grass under her feet crunched like brittle bones. Another step. The sunlight seemed to dim as she approached the circle, even though there were no clouds in the sky. Shadows clung to the space between the trees, and the wind refused to enter. Molly stopped just outside the perimeter. The trees were dead, or nearly. Leaves blackened and curled, trunks split with long, dry cracks like veins. But their roots looked alive. She noticed now that they seemed to coil inward, not outward, as if feeding something buried at the center. In the exact middle, the soil was bare. No weeds, no grass, just cracked earth. A depression. Shallow, slight, like something below had shifted. Molly felt a chill. She didn't know why, but she felt like if she stepped into that circle, she would vanish. She turned to leave, but a flicker of red caught her eye. Just beneath one of the trees, barely visible beneath the dust and dry leaves, a thin red thread lay coiled like a vein emerging from flesh. She crouched to look closer, but didn't touch it. Not yet. The thread pulsed. Only once. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch, as if something beneath the soil had felt her presence. Molly gasped and stumbled backward. She didn't remember how she got back to the house, only that she ran, didn't look back, didn't breathe until the door slammed shut behind her. Lin was waiting in the kitchen, already dressed, already smiling. "Where did you go, Mama?" "Just outside," she said, still catching her breath. "To the trees?" Lin asked sweetly. Molly stared. "How did you know that?" Lin tilted her head. "She told me you would." Molly's skin prickled. "Who told you?" Lin's voice changed, not in sound but in tone, too calm, too rehearsed, too old. "She doesn't like being forgotten," Lin said. "She says the trees are her ribs now." That afternoon, Arun returned from the village with a bag full of salt, limes, and a bundle of dried leaves wrapped in banana bark. He said Pravichai said we should bury this around the house to keep her away. Molly didn't laugh this time. She helped him. Together they walked the property, placing pieces of lime at the corners of the yard, sprinkling salt along the steps, and hanging the banana bark above each door. But every time she passed near the circle, she felt it, watching, waiting, listening. Lin never went near the trees, but at exactly 3 a.m. every night, she began to stand in corners, silent, still, always facing the wall. When Molly tried to move her, Lin would whisper, "If I turn around, she'll be right there." Arun became obsessed with the history of the village. He visited the temple archives, spoke to elders, dug through records, and eventually he found her name, Nanthida, a girl accused of sorcery in the year 1911. There had been a famine, the worst in recorded memory. Crops failed, children died, the people were desperate. And when desperation grows, so does superstition. They said Nanthida talked to the trees, that she walked alone in the forest at night, that her hair never grew, that birds died when she looked at them. No proof, no trial, only fear. So they took her, and they buried her standing, with her eyes sewn open so she could never close them, with her body bound in red thread so her soul could not escape. They planted 7 banana trees in a circle above her to trap her spirit. A curse disguised as a burial, a sentence disguised as justice, and a promise that she would never be forgotten. That evening, as the sun bled across the hills, Arun returned home with a photocopy of Nanthida's death record. He placed it on the table. Molly stared at it. A grainy photo, faded ink, and beneath the official seal, a single line, "Buried standing, eyes bound open. Do not exhume, do not disturb. May she never rise." But that night, Lin whispered in her sleep, "She's not in the ground anymore, Papa. She's already standing." On the 3rd night, Lin stopped speaking Thai. She still opened her mouth, still moved her lips, but the words that came out were not hers. They were slower, thicker, sharp and fluid like water hitting fire. A language neither Arun nor Molly had ever heard or could begin to understand. It began during breakfast. Lin sat quietly at the table, her spoon clinking gently against a bowl of rice porridge. Then, without warning, she placed the spoon down and whispered something under her breath. Molly froze. "Lin?" The girl looked up, eyes calm but distant, as though she were listening to a conversation no one else could hear. And then she spoke again. 5 words, long, low, wet like moss and cold like stone. Not Thai, not English, not any dialect from the region. It wasn't even human in rhythm, more like something remembered by the earth itself. Arun, confused, crouched beside her. "Sweetheart, what are you saying?" Lin tilted her head slowly. Then she smiled, but not at him, at the space just behind him. "She's closer now," she said, this time in Thai. Then she switched back to the other tongue, repeating the phrase again and again and again, as if reciting a spell or answering a call. Later that day, Molly brought Lin to the temple. The monks were polite but hesitant. None wanted to go near the girl. Even the abbot, a man known for calm and clarity, stepped back as Lin entered. One of the younger novices, barely more than a boy, volunteered to sit with her. He lasted 7 minutes. Then, without warning, he screamed, threw his prayer beads across the floor, and began slapping his own face over and over, eyes wide in horror. "She's in the walls! She's everywhere!" They had to carry him out of the hall, his mouth foaming, his eyes locked on Lin. He repeated one word as he was taken away. "Standing." That evening, Molly opened a notebook and began recording everything. Dates, times, words Lin spoke. Her handwriting became shaky over time, because when she tried to write down the strange phrases Lin had whispered, the ink would smear, the pen would jam. Sometimes the paper itself would tear, as if cut by invisible fingernails. On one page, she wrote, "Lin said the girl sleeps beneath our feet, but only during the rain. There's been no rain in 31 days. On another, "Lin stood in the hallway for 2 hours today, whispering to the ceiling. The shadows moved without wind." And on a third, hastily scribbled before the ink exploded across the page, she said, "Nanthida wants to be remembered by becoming someone else." Arun, increasingly desperate, took a photograph of the red thread near the banana trees and posted it in an online forum for folklore and spiritual anomalies. Most people laughed, a few offered mock rituals, but one reply stood out. No name, no profile, just a single message. If it's rising, it's listening. If it's listening, it's learning. If it's learning, it's becoming. That night, Lin did not sleep. She simply stood in the hallway, eyes open, speaking in the other language again, this time louder, clearer, more confident. She raised her hands above her head and whispered toward the ceiling, then to the floor. Then she placed her palms against the wooden wall and pressed her forehead against it. Her lips barely moved, but her voice was strong, like she wasn't talking to the room, but through it. At 2:33 a.m., Arun crept out of bed and recorded her on his phone. But when he played it back, there was no video, only black screen and an audio file full of static, until 1 second of clear sound. A woman's voice whispering, "Let me in." By morning, Lin was back to normal, eating cereal, drawing cats. But her drawings had changed. No longer colorful, hatty sketches of animals or trees. Now, each picture was of a woman. Same face, always with open eyes, wide, glassy, full of red veins. Always surrounded by thread, wrapping her body, twisting through her hands, tied around her throat. One drawing showed the woman upside down, standing on the ceiling above a bed. Another showed her standing in the corner of a room while a small child lay sleeping. And one showed the woman walking into Lin's skin like a coat being worn backwards. That afternoon, Lin handed Arun a piece of paper. "Drawn this for you, Papa," she said. He unfolded it. It was a sketch of himself. Eyes sewn open, mouth missing, thread wrapped around his arms, pulling him like a puppet. Above him, in the top corner of the paper, was written a word, not in Thai, not in English. But Arun knew what it meant, because that night, when he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw a smear of red thread just beneath the skin of his neck. And when he scratched at it, he didn't feel skin, he felt fabric. Molly hadn't slept in 3 nights. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the earth breathing beneath her, a slow, hollow exhale through the floorboards. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded like someone beneath the house, whispering through soil, waiting for her to drift off. But on the fourth night, exhaustion won. She didn't remember falling asleep. One moment she was staring at the ceiling. The next, she was somewhere else. A dream. But not like any dream she'd ever had. She was underground. The air was tight, heavy. The walls pressed in close, made of damp soil laced with roots and the remnants of bones. There was no light source, yet she could see. Everything had a reddish hue, as if the world itself was soaked in blood and thread. She tried to move, but her limbs responded sluggishly, like her body wasn't hers anymore. Then she heard it, the sound of thread being pulled, a soft, taut, snapping noise over and over, like a puppeteer testing strings. She turned and saw the girl. Buried up to her chest in earth, facing upward. Her body was stiff, unmoving, but her eyes were open, wide open, sewn open, black veins crawling from the corners like cracked glass. She didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't speak, but Molly could feel her voice. It echoed inside her skull, not words, but a rhythm, a pattern, like fingers tapping on the inside of her bones. Suddenly, the earth around the girl began to rise, swallowing her head. But before it did, her mouth moved, not to speak, to smile. And Molly finally understood what she was seeing. This wasn't a memory. This was a place, a prison, not of stone or bars, but of ritual, bound by the red thread, bound in the circle of trees, buried standing, so her spirit would look up forever. But someone had broken the boundary. Someone had touched the thread. And now, the walls were thinning. Molly woke up screaming. Arun rushed to her, grabbing her shoulders, trying to calm her down. "What happened? What did you see?" She couldn't answer at first, only shook her head violently, as if trying to erase what was still clinging to her brain. Then she looked at her hands. Her fingernails were packed with dirt. Later that day, she sat at the edge of the banana circle, staring at the cracked earth in the middle. The red thread was closer now, pushing through the soil like veins rising to the surface of skin. She didn't touch it, but she saw something that hadn't been there before. A small indentation in the center of the circle. A footprint. Not an animal. Human. Small. Bare. Pressed into the dry ground from the inside. That night, Arun slept on the floor in Lynn's room, afraid to leave her alone. But sleep still came, and with it, the dream. He stood on a hill above the village, watching as the trees writhed in a wind he could not feel. The sky above was black, not from night, but from something hanging low like a sheet pulled over the stars. He looked down at the house, at the circle of trees, at the earth that seemed to be breathing. And then the ground cracked open. Not like an earthquake, like something was pushing upward. He heard a voice in his left ear, Lynn's voice. "She's climbing, Papa." Then he saw it. Hands, thin, pale, covered in red thread. They broke the surface of the circle first, not clawing, but rising gently like someone lifting their arms for a hug. Then the top of a head, long black hair matted with mud, eyes still open, still sewn, still watching. Arun tried to scream, but no sound came. He woke up gasping, sweat-soaked, heart racing. Lin was no longer in bed. She was standing in the corner again, but this time facing him. Her eyes were open, but wrong, too wide, too still. She raised one hand slowly and whispered, "She's not dreaming anymore." The next morning, Arun found muddy footprints inside the house again, but they were no longer on the ceiling. They were on the walls, trailing downward, as if someone had begun walking from above.
The old monk didn't want to speak at first. Arun had returned to the temple alone, this time with offerings, incense, sticky rice, dried fish wrapped in lotus leaves. Prawichai accepted the gifts in silence, motioned for Arun to sit, and lit a thin coil of sandalwood. The room filled with smoke that curled like ghost fingers. "You were not supposed to live in that house," the old man finally said. "But now, it's too late." Arun clenched his fists. "Who is she? The girl buried in the trees. Tell me everything." Prawichai didn't answer with words at first. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside was a photograph, black and white, faded, edges frayed. It showed a group of villagers gathered around something or someone. In the center stood a girl, no older than 13, eyes wide open, mouth sewn shut, arms bound in red thread. Her feet were already buried in the ground. Arun felt the air leave his lungs. "Nanthida," the monk said. She was not a witch. She was just different. The year was 1911. The drought came early that year, and it never left. Rice fields cracked open like wounded skin. Buffalo dropped dead mid-plow. Children starved. Old people withered. And in every tragedy, the villagers saw a cause, a scapegoat, someone to blame. That someone was Nanthida. She was born under an eclipse. She never cried as a baby. Animals avoided her. She spoke to herself in the forest. And one day she whispered something to a sick child, and that child died that very night. Coincidence? Maybe. But fear doesn't care for logic. It only needs a spark. The villagers came for her during a new moon. No trial, no defense. They dragged her to the center of the field and dug a hole, deep enough for a body to stand. It was not just vengeance. It was a ritual. Something they remembered from old stories, whispers passed down by midwives and drunks. They believed that burying a cursed soul upright, with eyes sewn open and mouth sealed shut, would bind their spirit to the land, make them watch, make them suffer, and most importantly, make them protect the village from further famine. A living sacrifice, a guardian, a warning. They tied her with red thread, a sacred color, said to bind ghosts in place. They whispered mantras. They poured ash from 7 burnt banana stalks over her feet, and they planted new banana trees around her, forming a circle to trap the spirit so she could not wander. The final step was the worst. They sewed her eyes open so she would never sleep, never look away, never forget what had been done to her. But the ritual was flawed, Prawichai said, voice like paper tearing. She was not a spirit when they buried her. She was still alive. Arun's heart dropped. You mean she died beneath the ground, slowly, in silence, in darkness, in hate? The monk leaned in, whispering now, and hate is louder than prayer. The villagers thought it had worked. Rain came the following year. Crops returned. No more deaths. They believed the sacrifice had pleased something, a god, a force, a hungry earth. But over time, strange things began to happen. Children spoke to shadows. Animals walked in circles until they died. Dreams of upward-facing corpses spread through generations. Every time there was a drought, someone would report seeing her. Not a ghost, a presence. Eyes always open, skin always muddy, thread always rising from the soil like roots that could think. She doesn't protect the village, Prawichai said. She punishes it, slowly, patiently. Arun trembled. Why didn't anyone tell us? The old monk looked up at him. Would you have believed it? He reached into his robe and handed Arun a worn piece of parchment, brittle, yellowed with time. A prayer, or perhaps a warning. If the thread rises, bury it again. If the earth breathes, do not listen. If the girl dreams, do not dream with her. And above all, never ever saw another's eyes shut in silence. When Arun returned to home, Mali was waiting at the door. I had another dream, she said. He could see it in her eyes, the hollow terror of someone who had seen too much. She was closer. That night, they both sat by Lin's bed, holding her small hands between theirs. The girl had stopped speaking in the strange language, but she had started humming. A slow, rhythmic melody neither of them recognized. Soft, gentle. But when Mali leaned in close, she realized it was a funeral chant, one used for those who died alone, those who were buried without permission.
It began with a whisper in the dirt. Not a sound, not a voice, just a sensation, as if the ground itself was humming in a tongue older than memory. Molly first noticed it while sweeping the yard near the circle of banana trees. The bristles of her broom snagged on something beneath the dust, something thin, coarse, and trembling. She knelt down. There it was, a thread, red, frayed, still moist with something that wasn't water. It had pushed through the soil like a shoot curling toward the light. Molly stared. It was longer now, stretching toward the edge of the circle, as if reaching, looking, choosing. She backed away, breath catching in her throat. The air around the circle was thick, too still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. That evening, Arun returned from the temple with a small pouch of ash and salt. Prawichai's final warning echoed in his head. If the thread touches flesh, it remembers the shape of the body, and it will want to wear it again. They sprinkled the ash in a line around the house. They poured salt at the corners, but the thread kept growing. By midnight, it had reached the front steps, and Lin, without a word, walked outside to meet it. Molly found her barefoot on the porch, standing perfectly still, staring at the thread as it brushed gently against her toe. The child didn't flinch, didn't blink. She simply looked down at it, like recognizing an old friend.
"Lin," she whispered, trying not to move. "Come here, baby." Slowly. Lin turned, but her face was wrong. Her expression was calm, her eyes too wide, her lips just beginning to smile. "She's cold," she said softly. "She wants my warmth." Molly rushed forward and scooped her up, cradling the girl tightly against her chest. But as she carried her inside, she felt it, the thread brushing her leg, just a touch, barely noticeable. But in that moment, something changed. That night, Molly's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She hid it from Arun, told him she was tired, that she needed rest. But in the bathroom, under the yellow bulb, she stared at her palm. There, on the inside of her wrist, was a faint red mark, a line, thread burn. But she hadn't wrapped anything. She hadn't touched rope, only the red thread. Just a moment, just a brush, and now her fingers twitched on their own. Her arm lifted in the dark, long after her mind told it to stay still. Her reflection in the mirror stared back at her, but the eyes didn't move at the same time. At 2:17 a.m., Arun woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. Molly was gone. So was Lin. He ran into the yard barefoot, heart hammering, calling their names. No answer. Then, a shape in the field. Two shadows standing side by side, one tall, one small, facing the circle of banana trees. He approached slowly. "Molly? Lin?" They didn't move. They were standing inside the circle, and the red thread, it had wrapped around both of them, tied at the wrists, looped around the ankles, drifting between them like a marionette's control lines. "Molly!" he shouted, but she didn't look at him. She turned her head upward to the night sky and whispered, "She's awake." The ground beneath their feet began to crack. From the center of the circle, the soil shifted, pulsed, then broke open like splitting skin, and something began to rise. Not fast, not violent, but deliberate, like it knew it had all the time in the world. First came the red thread, miles of it, unspooling from the earth like veins pulled free from a corpse. Then, fingertips, pale, delicate, fingernails black with soil, skin stretched too tightly over bones. Then, eyes, still sewn open, still watching, but this time, they blinked. Arun screamed. He charged into the circle, grabbed Molly and Lin by the arms, ripped at the thread, burning his hands. But when he looked up, the girl was gone. Only soil remained, flat, undisturbed, as if she had never risen at all. Only the thread remained, cut in pieces, twitching on the ground like worms dying in the sun. He carried them both inside. Neither of them spoke. Lin stared at the ceiling. Molly stared at her own hands. And Arun, he didn't sleep. Because when he washed his hands in the sink, the red thread was still there, floating in the drain, tied in a perfect loop, a noose.
Word had spread, not just whispers, but warnings. Neighbors who passed the Jurasuk house now walked faster, eyes downcast, muttering protective prayers under their breath. Even the village dogs stopped barking near the gate. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition. They had seen this before. On the 7th day since the thread rose, an elder from the neighboring village came knocking. He didn't speak much, only bowed, removed his sandals, and stepped into the house as if he already knew what waited inside. His name was Sao Ratanakorn. He was not a monk, not a priest, but something older, a more P, a spirit caller, one who could speak between the worlds and had once banished a hungry ghost from a river that swallowed children. He was their last hope. He wore robes the color of faded leaves and carried a bundle wrapped in banana bark. Inside were strange tools, a bell with no clapper, a mirror painted black, a strip of raw silk, and a bowl of pig's blood that had already begun to curdle. He placed Lin in the center of the room and drew a ring of salt and rice flour around her. She didn't resist, didn't move. She sat cross-legged, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes half closed, as if she was only visiting her own body. The shaman didn't speak to Arun or Mali. His voice was for her, the girl who was watching through Lin's skin. He chanted in a dialect no one recognized, a blend of Northern Thai, Pali, and something older. With each verse, the room darkened, not from light, but from presence. The air became heavy. The corners of the house twisted slightly, like they were bending inward. And then Lin opened her mouth, not to scream, but to echo. She began to chant back, matching Sao Ratanakorn word for word, line for line, but her voice was layered. It echoed like many mouths were speaking at once from deep inside her throat. Some sounded like children, some sounded like women gasping through dirt. One was silent, yet it scraped behind the ears like bone on metal. The shaman's voice wavered. He opened the black mirror and held it in front of Lin's face. "Tell me your name. Speak it, and I will send you back to the earth." Lin smiled, and then she raised her hand. 2 fingers lifted, slow and stiff, like sticks, and touched the mirror. It shattered, without sound, without motion, just crumbled into black dust. The bowl of pig's blood boiled, the bell with no clapper rang, the salt ring evaporated, and Lin's eyes turned entirely red. Then came the scream, not from Lin, from Sao Ratanakorn. He stumbled backward, clutching his face, dropping his tools. Her eyes are inside mine! He clawed at them, digging into the sockets, blood pouring down his cheeks. I see her standing! I see her standing! I see her! And then silence. He collapsed, motionless. His eyes had not been removed, but they had turned completely black. He was blind, and not from injury, from invasion. They carried him out wrapped in mats, his breathing shallow, his hands twitching as though still reaching for something only he could see. Before they left, the novice who accompanied him whispered to Arun, "He's not lost. She's just using his sight now, to see through others, to find the ones who remember." That night, Lin spoke for the first time in her own voice. She looked at her parents and said, "I think I'm almost done being me." Then she went to bed and hummed the funeral chant again. Molly didn't sleep. She sat at the window, staring at the banana trees swaying without wind. Then she saw it. Someone standing in the middle of the circle. Tall, thin, head slightly tilted. Not moving, not even breathing. She blinked, and the shape was gone. but on the wooden floor beneath her, a single red thread had appeared, tied in a loop and slowly tightening.
The mirror was old. Molly had brought it from their previous home, a tall, freestanding antique with a wooden frame carved into lotus petals. It used to sit in their bedroom, angled toward the morning light. Now, she kept it covered with a cloth. She didn't know when the fear started. Maybe the first time she caught a flicker that wasn't her reflection. Maybe the night Lynn walked past it and her reflection didn't follow. Or maybe it was last night, when in the dim light, she looked into the mirror and saw herself blinking, half a second too late. She told herself it was fatigue, lack of sleep, stress, overactive imagination. But something about her reflection had changed. It wasn't just her face, it was the way the mirror looked back. One morning, as Molly combed Lynn's hair, she caught the child staring at the mirror's cloth. "Do you miss it?" Molly asked gently. Lynn didn't blink. "She's in there." Molly stopped. "Who?" Lynn's lips curled into a half smile. "She said she remembers what it's like to be a daughter." Then she looked at Molly, and for a second, her eyes weren't Lynn's. They were older, knowing, hungry, tired of watching. "She likes how I feel. I'm warm and clean and small." That night, Molly uncovered the mirror again. She needed to see, to prove it was in her head, to fight back. She lit a single candle and placed it near the base of the glass. Then she stared. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Just her own eyes staring back, dark-rimmed from exhaustion, haunted by everything she'd witnessed. But then the candle flickered, only once, and in the mirror, her reflection smiled. But Molly hadn't. She stepped back, heart racing. The reflection continued to stare, unblinking, weighing, and then it spoke. Not with lips, not with sound, but in Molly's own voice, inside her head. "You look just like her, but softer, more breakable." Molly dropped the cloth and threw it over the mirror. Her hands shook violently. Behind the fabric, the glass made a soft tapping sound. Once, twice, like a finger trying to get out. The next day, Lynn vanished. She had only been alone for 5 minutes. Arun had gone to the garden. Molly was in the kitchen. When she returned to the bedroom, Lynn was gone. The door was still locked, the windows shut. No footprints, no sound, just an open notebook on the floor, filled with pages of red crayon scribbles. Words in a language Molly didn't know, symbols scratched violently, eyes drawn over and over again, each one wider than the last. In the corner of the last page, "She needed to walk, so I let her." Panic seized the house. They searched everywhere, inside, outside, even the neighbor's property. Nothing. Until just after dusk, Molly found her, standing inside the banana tree circle, eyes open, barefoot, face expressionless. Her fingernails were black with dirt. Molly ran to her, grabbed her shoulders. "Lynn, what are you doing?" Lynn tilted her head. "She found her mouth. She can speak again, but she uses mine." They brought Lynn inside. That night, Molly locked a mirror in the storage room. But at 3:03 a.m., it was back in the bedroom, uncovered, perfectly clean, standing directly at the foot of their bed. Neither Molly nor Arun remembered moving it. And in its glass, the candlelight flickered without flame, and something was breathing just behind the surface. Later that morning, Molly finally snapped. She carried the mirror outside, poured kerosene across its surface, lit a match. The flames danced for seconds, then extinguished themselves. The mirror did not crack. The frame did not burn. Instead, a single red thread unfurled from the edge of the glass and curled across the dirt. It slithered toward her like a tongue, and Molly screamed. She and Arun buried the mirror that afternoon, 2 meters deep, behind the chicken coop. But that night, when they returned to their room, the mirror was waiting. Same corner, same angle. No dirt, no scratches. Only a single message carved into the wooden frame that hadn't been there before. She does not reflect. She remembers.
The first time it happened, Arun thought it was just exhaustion. He woke in the hallway, barefoot, standing perfectly still, his hands pressed flat against the wall. There was no memory of getting out of bed, no dreams, no noise, just the silence of 3:11 a.m. and the feeling that something had been using his body while he wasn't home. He didn't tell Molly, not when it happened again and again. Each night he woke in a different place, facing the mirror in the kitchen, kneeling in front of the back door, standing outside in the yard, one hand resting on the banana tree bark. Always alone, always unaware, always cold, not from air, but from something inside him that no longer felt like it belonged to him. One night he woke holding the knife, not pointing it, just holding it, calmly, neatly, like a tool being placed in his hand by someone else. His fingers were curled gently around the handle. His thumb traced the edge, as if remembering it, practicing. It terrified him more than the nightmares, because in dreams you can run. But Arun had stopped dreaming. Sleep was now just a tunnel, a passage he fell through and someone else used to climb upward. He set up a camera in the bedroom, not for proof, for understanding. He needed to know what he did between 2 and 4 a.m., the hours that felt like missing pages in his own story. The next morning he reviewed the footage. It was worse than he imagined. He watched himself sit up at 2:14 a.m., not abruptly, but gracefully, as if guided by invisible hands. He stood, walked to the mirror, and smiled. But what chilled Arun wasn't the expression, it was the voice. He leaned in close to the speaker and heard his own mouth say, softly, "I remember how it feels to wear skin." Then, still smiling, he turned to the window and began whispering words in the same unknown language Lin had spoken days earlier. Each word was sung, not said, like a lullaby from the dirt. Then he stopped, looked directly into the camera, and said, in a woman's voice, "Don't watch me unless you're ready to see." Arun deleted the footage, but the image burned in his memory, not because of the words, because of the eyes. For just a moment, less than a second, his pupils had split, one looking forward, one looking down, as if there were two people inside the same skull. He went to the village healer the next day. Not Pravichai, the monk was already gone, vanished, his hut abandoned. Instead, Arun found an old woman named May San, a midwife turned exorcist, known for speaking only in riddles and never looking anyone in the eye. He told her what was happening, how he was losing time. She didn't speak for a long while. Then, without lifting her gaze, she said, "You are not being possessed. You are being rehearsed." Arun blinked. "What?" Maysen picked up a piece of charcoal and drew a figure in the dirt, a stickman with lines coiling around his limbs. Spirits don't always take over. They try on your walk, your voice, your habits, until one day you don't wake up. They do. That night, Arun stayed awake. He forced himself to sit upright in the bedroom, watching Molly sleep, holding Lin's old toy bell in one hand, something to anchor him. But just after 2:30 a.m., his vision blurred. Not like sleep, like slipping, like being pulled backward into himself. The world didn't fade, it inverted. The room turned inside out, folding at the edges like a page curling in fire. And then, nothing. Darkness, silence, and the soft sound of his own voice chanting from very, very far away. He woke at dawn. His feet were muddy. His hands were shaking. His fingernails were full of red thread. Molly found him later standing in front of the bathroom mirror. He wasn't moving, just staring. When she touched his shoulder, he turned slowly and whispered, "She's almost done memorizing me."
It began with a sound, a soft, dry scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood. Not frantic, not aggressive, rhythmic, almost patient. Molly first heard it around midnight. She was alone in the kitchen, cleaning dishes by candlelight. The power had gone out again, the third time this week. Outside, the banana trees stood still under the moon, unmoving in the windless night. And beneath her feet came the sound. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Longer pause. Then the whisper. So faint, she thought it was her imagination. A breath pressed against the underside of the floorboards, just beneath her heels. Ma. She dropped the plate. It shattered. She didn't move. The whisper came again. Lee. The voice was Lin's, but Lin was asleep in her room. Or she should have been. Molly rushed down the hallway and opened Lin's door. The bed was empty. Sheets pulled back. The window still shut. No sign of her. She turned to call for Arun, but the house had changed. Somehow, without her noticing, the lights were off. The air was thicker. The walls were wet to the touch. And then the sound again, from directly beneath the floor. Soft, scraping, moving slowly from one room to the next. A whisper following it like steam. Let me be her again." Molly dropped to her knees and pressed her ear to the floor. What she heard made her blood run cold. Humming, the same funeral lullaby Lynn had been murmuring in her sleep, now sung from under the floorboards. The rhythm, perfect. The voice, not quite Lynn's. Too slow, too hollow, like the sound of someone singing with a mouth full of earth. Then came the knocking. 3 knocks. Not on the door, from inside the floor, directly beneath where she was kneeling. She scrambled back, breath ragged. The knocking followed. 3 more knocks, further down the hallway. Then again, closer, moving, room by room. The floorboards shuddered, dust falling from between the cracks. And then the voice rose again, this time clearer. Not a whisper, a plea. "Open it. I've waited long enough." Arun burst from the bedroom, wild-eyed, holding Lynn in his arms. I found her standing in the corner. She was staring at the floor, whispering directions, he said. Molly backed against the wall. "She's underneath." Arun's face went pale. "What?" "She's not just in Lynn, she's beneath us. She's moving through the house." They didn't sleep that night. They sat in the center of the living room, Lynn between them, surrounded by salt and candles. The floor creaked beneath them, but they dared not move. And sometime before dawn, Molly saw it. A small, thin hole in the corner of the room. Where there had been solid wood the day before, now there was a gap, no larger than a coin, from which a red thread slowly uncoiled. It slithered toward them, inch by inch, dragging behind it the scent of wet soil and old blood. Molly didn't scream. She was too tired, too hollow. She simply whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "She's not rising through the earth anymore. She's rising through the house." By sunrise, the red thread had vanished. So had the hole. But the wood in that corner remained darker, softer, almost rotten, as if something was feeding on the house itself. That afternoon, Arun tore up one of the floorboards. Beneath it, there was no foundation, no packed dirt, no concrete, just hollow darkness filled with shifting threads, dozens of them, tangled, pulsing, breathing, like veins waiting for a body. And in the center of them, something blinked. Not eyes, not quite, but something that remembered being alive. They sealed the floor again, hung more protective charms, but nothing worked. The house no longer resisted the curse. It welcomed it. The wood whispered. The walls sweated. The mirrors fogged with breath that didn't belong to them. And every night they heard footsteps inside the walls. Not rats, not ghosts. Someone learning how to walk again. His name was Tao Noi. No one called him by his real name anymore. He was the oldest man in the village, or at least the oldest left alive. Nearly deaf, nearly blind, but not nearly as senile as he pretended to be. Most people thought he no longer remembered the past, but Tao Noi remembered everything, especially her. Arun found him by accident. He was asking around for anyone who might have known Nanthida, expecting silence, maybe vague myths. Instead, one of the younger monks whispered, "The one who held the thread still breathes." They directed him to a shack at the edge of the forest, where the trees grew denser and the shadows seemed thicker than the daylight should allow. There, Sitting on a mat, sharpening a bone-handled knife with no intent to use it, was Tao Noi. Arun bowed low. "I need to ask about Nanthida." The old man didn't look up. He didn't need to. "I saw her die," Tao Noi said, voice rough like bark. "But she never stopped looking at me." Arun sat slowly. "Tell me everything." Tao Noi's hands trembled as he laid the knife aside. And then he spoke, not like a confession, but like a sentence being carried out. "I was 15 when they buried her. My uncle was the one who sewed her eyes open. My father held the thread. I stood by with the bowl of ash, too scared to move." She wasn't crying. That's the part no one talks about. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just kept looking at us. Even when the thread was wrapped around her throat, even when the priest whispered the curse, even when the earth was shoveled in around her feet, then her legs, then her chest, she never looked away. Arun asked softly, "Why did they do it?" Tao Noi didn't answer first. Then, with a bitter laugh, "Because they thought burying one girl would feed the fields. They were wrong. All they did was feed her." Arun leaned closer. "How did you survive all these years?" Tao Noi's eyes were cloudy, but focused now, sharp with memory. "I lied," he said. "I told everyone I forgot her face, that I was too young to remember, that I never held the ash bowl. But she knew. She always knew." That night, Arun brought Molly to Tao Noi's shack, but he was gone. Not just absent, gone. The door was open, his bed untouched. Only one thing left behind, a square mirror, face down, with a red thread wrapped around its frame, and something carved into the wall with shaking hands. I looked again. The villagers found his body 2 days later. Not buried, not torn, not bloodied, just standing upright inside his home, eyes open, sewn crudely with fishing wire. Thread looped around his wrists, his ankles, his tongue. No signs of struggle, no wounds, only a note pinned to his shirt, written in what looked like his own handwriting. "She forgives the dead, not the forgetful." That night, Lynn stood at the foot of her parents' bed, eyes closed. She whispered. He remembered her face before he died, so she let him borrow it one last time. And then she smiled. Not like a child, but like someone who had won something ancient. In the darkness, Arun whispered to Molly, "She doesn't want revenge." Molly turned, voice shaking. "Then what does she want?" Arun looked at Lynn, standing so still, and said, "She wants a body, a name, and a world that remembers who she was, even when she's no longer buried."
They had tried once, years ago, maybe 40, maybe more. Arun found the story buried in the back of a temple record book, hidden behind brittle pages of half-burned parchment. A monk, young at the time, brave or foolish, had attempted to unravel the curse by performing a counter-ritual. The goal was simple in concept, impossible in execution. To close her eyes, to sew them shut, to give her rest, to end the watching. He believed that if her eyes finally closed, her spirit would dissolve into sleep, into forgiveness, into silence. He was wrong. His name was Phra Samchai. He had read ancient texts, forgotten chants, and practiced the ritual for years. On the night of the blood moon, he stepped alone into the circle of banana trees with a spool of white thread, the thread
of rest. They found him the next morning, still kneeling, still holding the needle, but his eyelids had been removed, not torn, taken, cleanly, as if something had wanted him to understand what it meant to never be allowed to look away. Mali read the account with trembling hands. "What does it mean?" she asked. Arun stared at the record, jaw tight. "It means her eyes don't stay open because of the curse," he whispered. "They stay open because they're the only thing left keeping her here." That night, Lin stopped blinking. Not once, not in her sleep, not at dinner, not even when the candlelight flickered directly into her face. She just stared, her gaze dry, unflinching, endless. Mali gently touched her cheek. "Sweetheart, your eyes." "I'm practicing. For her." Arun took action. He drove to a monastery 2 provinces away, where a retired monk known for unbinding spirits lived in seclusion. The monk, Fra Arjan Mathea, listened in silence as Arun spoke. He never interrupted. When Arun finished, the monk looked him in the eyes and said one sentence: "You do not close the eyes of the dead unless you are willing to take their place." Arun blinked. "What does that mean?" The monk replied, "Someone must always be watching. If you close hers, she will need new ones." Back home, Mali tried to coax Lin into blinking. She played games, brought eye drops, pretended to count. But Lin refused. Her eyes now looked glassy, not dry, but preserved, like they belonged to something that no longer cared for blinking, or sleeping, or pretending to be alive. That night, Arun returned with a talisman, a small brass eye wrapped in sacred cloth. He placed it under Lin's pillow. At exactly 2:46 a.m., it exploded. Not with fire, but with blood. Dark, thick, and old, as if it had waited centuries to be released. The bedsheets soaked instantly. Lin didn't move. She only whispered. She doesn't want protection. She wants presence. The next day, Arun walked into the forest. He returned to the circle of banana trees. The earth was cracked and bleeding sap. The roots pulsed like arteries. The thread was everywhere, and in the center, an eye. Not floating, not buried, embedded in the dirt, staring up at him, red, alive, unblinking. It rolled slightly as he approached, like it recognized him. And in that moment, he heard a voice, not aloud, not inside his head. It came from the space between thoughts. "Close them, and you'll never open yours again." That night, Lin spoke again, only this time it wasn't her voice. It was Nanthida's, older, hoarse, dry like wind scraping through bone. "They tried to blind me. They tried to bury me in darkness, but even soil can't silence sight. You think I want to rest? No, I want to be seen." Mali, eyes wide with grief, asked through tears, "What happens if we close your eyes?" Lin smiled, and for the first time in days, she blinked. Once, then whispered, "Then yours will open in my place." It happened just after dawn. A soft scream broke the silence, not from the Jirasuk home, but from the old woman across the road who'd come out to sweep her front steps. She had dropped her broom and fallen to her knees because the banana trees were bleeding. It wasn't sap, it was thicker, darker, running in slow rivulets from the cracks in the trunks, thick as veins, pooling at the base like sacrificial offerings. The red liquid soaked into the dirt. But no flies came, no scent of rot, just the metallic sting of something ancient resurfacing. And on every tree, etched faintly into the bark, was a single shape, an eye, unblinking, wide, watching. By noon, the village was in chaos. Elders whispered of a sign they'd only heard in stories. When the trees of the Watcher wept, it meant the spirit no longer wanted to stay buried. She wasn't calling out anymore. She was climbing. Villagers who had dismissed the story, who laughed at Molly and Arun just days ago, now kept their children indoors. Some hung garlic and limes on their doors. Some poured ash around their fields. One family left the village altogether, leaving behind their livestock and possessions. But the worst came when a group of men tried to cut the trees down. They came with machetes and chainsaws, 5 in total. Each one had family ties to the burial generation. Each one claimed they had nothing to do with Nanthida's death. Their plan was simple: cut down the 7 trees, burn the roots, salt the earth. The first swing never landed. The blade stopped inches from the bark, and the man holding it began to tremble. His arms locked, his pupils dilated. He dropped the machete and stared at his own hands as blood began to seep from beneath his fingernails. He fell to the ground convulsing, whispering through clenched teeth, "She's in the trees." The second man screamed and fled. The third stood frozen, staring at the bleeding bark and whispered, "She's not bound anymore. She's rooted." Only one tree was wounded. Just one. But that night, the house nearest to it burned from the inside out. No signs of arson, no fuel, no flame trail. Only a single thread hanging from the charred ceiling beam, tied in a loop, spinning gently, as if twirled by invisible fingers. Molly watched from her window, clutching Lynn to her chest. The villagers stopped knocking on their door after that. They no longer came with questions or blame. They came with gifts, candles, offerings of fruit, small dolls made from bamboo and rice straw, coins left at the gate wrapped in red cloth. They left them without words, because they weren't for the family. They were for her, for the girl beneath the ground who no longer wanted prayers, only acknowledgement. And then the dreams began to spread. Other children started waking up screaming. One said she dreamed of standing in mud while someone whispered instructions into her ear. Another saw a girl's face staring at her through the mirror in her closet, mouthing words she couldn't hear but somehow still understood. And one boy, only 4 years old, refused to wear shoes anymore. When asked why, he said, "She likes it better when we touch the earth with our skin." At the temple, a young monk tried to hold a protection ritual. He collapsed mid-chant. When they carried him to the back room, his hands were covered in thread burn, the kind caused by pulling against something too tight, too fast. But no rope had touched him. And as he drifted in and out of consciousness, he kept repeating one phrase: "Don't look away from her.
don't let her be forgotten again. Arun stood at the edge of the banana circle that evening, staring at the trees that were now part of the curse, not a prison. The bleeding had slowed, but the ground beneath the trees had darkened, like a bruise. He could feel it in his bones. The earth itself had become her body, and the village was now her skin. That night, Len spoke a full sentence in her own voice for the first time in days. She turned to her parents and whispered, "She's not haunting us anymore." Molly leaned down. "Then what is she doing?" Lynn blinked once. "She's growing."
At first, it was just a feeling. The kind of quiet you notice after something stops moving. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful, but poised, like breath being held, like a question waiting to be answered. The Jurassic house had always been old, creaky, uneven, but now it had gone silent. No groaning beams, no shifting joints, no sound from the wind through the wooden slats. It felt as if the house had stopped breathing, because something else was breathing in its place. Molly noticed it first. The kitchen window, once facing the road, now faced the wrong direction. The sunrise used to pour in each morning. Now it never did. She stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, heart pounding. The kitchen hadn't moved, but the world outside had. Arun discovered it next. He opened a door in the hallway, a small storage closet he'd opened 100 times, but this time, behind it was a staircase, descending, made of stone, winding deep, far deeper than the house should have allowed. There was no draft, no dust, just a cold breath rising from below. He closed the door, locked it, blocked it with furniture. But the next morning, the door was gone. Only a wall remained, as if the house had swallowed the evidence of its own transformation. Then the hallways began to stretch. Molly walked from the bedroom to the living room, a 15-step distance, but she counted 42. The doors at the end of the hall now led to identical rooms, perfectly mirrored, with furniture arranged in impossible symmetry. When she stood between them, she heard a voice, not aloud, but in the architecture itself. "Every step builds me. Every memory feeds me. I am no longer buried. I am built." Lynn began sleeping on the floor, not by choice, but by compulsion. She would awake each night, crawl from bed, and lie directly in the center of the living room, arms by her sides, palms upward. Her eyes remained open, always facing the ceiling, always aligned with the darkened beam overhead, where a single red thread now hung from the rafters like a pendulum. Tick, 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 not swinging, beating. The mirror returned. Molly had buried it, Arun had shattered it, but now it stood in the hallway, full length, flawless, no cracks, no scratches. Only one difference. It didn't reflect the house. When they looked into it, they saw a different version of their home, twisted, extended, reshaped into something more ancient. The walls lined with rotting wood beams, red cloth draped like temple banners, and in every reflection, a girl standing at the end of each hallway, facing away, arms by her side, still, waiting. The ceilings grew taller. The windows narrowed into slits. The air grew colder near the corners, warmer at the center, as if the heart of the house had moved, as if it now beat beneath the floor. One morning, Arun walked into what had once been Lin's room and stopped. It was gone. The walls remained, but the bed, the shelves, the curtains, all had vanished. In their place stood a single mat woven from black grass, and above it, burned into the wood, a single symbol, an open eye, surrounded by 7 banana leaves. They were no longer living in their house. They were living in hers. She had not risen from the grave. She had simply risen through the wood, whispering through the beams, curling through the nails, shaping space like memory shapes pain. The house had become her body, and they were inside it. That night, Lin stood in the hallway, arms outstretched. She turned her head slowly and said, "She doesn't want to be remembered anymore. She wants to be recognized."
It was never 7 trees. That's what the story said. That's what the villagers believed. 7 trees in a perfect circle. 7 markers. 7 seals. But legends are always missing something. And the curse had always been waiting for someone to notice what wasn't there. It was Arun who saw it first, not in the real world, but in a dream that didn't feel like his own. He was standing in the banana circle again, the sky above him black, churning like smoke trapped beneath glass. The trees around him twisted inward, their trunks pulsing like veins. At the center, the earth cracked open. He could see the roots of the banana trees stretching deep, long spiraled things wrapped in thread, throbbing with unseen energy. All 6 were visible. 6, not 7. And in the space where the 7th root should have been, a hole, empty, alive, calling. Arun woke, gasping for air, mud on his hands and knees. He had sleepwalked again. Out of the house, into the yard, into the circle. There, in the center, the ground had split. A crevice, small but deep, with a faint red glow bleeding from the cracks. And near the edge, a new root just beginning to surface. It was not like the others. This one was black, slick with sap that steamed in the air. It didn't grow upward. It pulled downward, like a hand reaching into the earth, not out of it. He called for Molly. They stood there together, staring down at the thing neither of them could name. And Lin walked up behind them, barefoot, whispering, "That's the one they couldn't grow. It needed time. It needed memory. It needed me." In the following days, the root grew, fast. By the second morning, it had split into 7 branches, each one wrapping beneath the others, forming a spiral beneath the trees. The ground began to rise with it, lifting, cracking, reshaping the land into something unnatural, like a mound or a spine. The villagers gathered, praying silently from afar. They no longer came to offer protection. They came to witness. They came because they understood, whether too late or too deeply, that something final was being prepared. One of the elders, a woman named Mei Lan, approached Arun in tears. She was shaking as she handed him a bundle wrapped in faded linen. Inside was a tooth, human, cracked, still tied with a thin coil of red thread. I pulled it from her mouth the night we buried her. I couldn't watch them sew her shut, so I kept a part of her to remember. I thought it would help, but it didn't. She doesn't want pieces. She wants completion. That night,
the seventh root bloomed, not with leaves, but with hair. Long black strands emerged from the soil like grass growing in fast forward, weaving together, forming a pattern at the center of the mound. A circle, a crown, and in the center of it all, a single eye opened. Just one, embedded in the dirt, wide, red-veined, unblinking. The moment it opened, the wind stopped. The birds vanished, and the house groaned, not with age, but with recognition, as if it had been waiting for that eye to open, to become complete. Inside, the hallway stretched further than ever before. Rooms shifted when they weren't being looked at. Doors opened to other versions of themselves, places they'd never built, filled with artifacts they never owned. And in every corner, tucked between shadows, a girl stood, hair covering her face, hands tied with red, not moving, not yet. Arun stood in the circle, heart pounding. The ground beneath him no longer felt like earth, it felt like skin. Lin approached and took his hand. She's not angry, she's just ready. Now that the root has returned, she can finally do what they stopped her from doing. And what's that? Arun asked quietly. Lin turned to the eye in the earth, smiled, and said, "Stand." There was no scream, no thunder, no trembling of earth, just stillness. And in that stillness, she rose. It began at 3:03 a.m., the hour when the house always breathed, the hour when the walls always whispered. But tonight, there was nothing. The house didn't creak, the wind didn't stir. Even the insects had gone silent, as if the world had drawn its last breath and was afraid to exhale. Arun woke without knowing why, not from noise, but from the absence of it. He sat up slowly. Lin was no longer in her bed. The front door was wide open, and outside, the mound where the seventh root had emerged was glowing faintly, not with light, but with presence. He stepped outside barefoot, cold dew soaking into his skin, and there she was, Lin, standing at the edge of the circle, but not alone. All around her the air shimmered like heat rising from ash, and within that shimmer something stood behind her. Not a figure, not a shadow, a shape that had no shape. It pulsed, it breathed, it waited, and then Lin moved. No, not moved, shifted. Her shoulders rolled back too slow, her head tilted upward, her arms dropped to her sides, and her lips parted just enough to release nothing. Not a sound, but Arun felt it, a weight in the air, like grief finally stepping through the door after knocking for generations. Behind her, the mound split, not with violence, but gracefully, as if something was returning, not escaping. From the center of the circle, a shape emerged, small, slender, covered in thread and soil. She was not crawling, she was standing. Perfect posture, eyes wide open, unblinking, as if she had never stopped standing, only waited to be seen. Nanthida, no longer a ghost, no longer a memory, a presence, a form, a return. But she didn't move toward anyone, she moved through the thread, through the house, through every person who had once heard her name and pretended to forget. And with each step, space changed. The hallway inside the house stretched endlessly. Molly walked into the kitchen and found herself in a schoolroom that no longer existed. A desk, a girl sitting alone, writing on the wall in red thread. They buried me with my eyes open. Now I want yours. Arun opened a closet and saw himself, not as he was, but as he might become, standing in the circle, eyes sewn open, hands limp, and a girl's hand resting gently on his shoulder, not possessive, just guiding. The mirrors across the house no longer reflected reality. They showed other versions of Lynn. Lynn sitting in a bath of thread. Lynn walking backward through a hallway that never ended. Lynn standing in a grave while her body looked down from above. And in each reflection, Nanthida stood behind her, whispering with lips that never moved. But no one screamed. Not Arun, not Molly, not Lynn. Because there was no horror in her rising, only completion. That morning, the sun never rose, not visibly. The sky stayed dark, like the hour before dawn stretched thin across the day. The birds stayed hidden. The wind never blew. But the villagers stepped outside, one by one, not because they were summoned, because they had remembered. Each one found a thread tied to their wrist, neck, or ankle. Each one knew what it meant. They were no longer separate from her. They were parts of her, witnesses. And in the center of the circle, Lynn turned around. Her eyes were her own, but her gaze was not. She looked at Arun and said, "She's done waiting. Now she walks, and she walks in many."
It started in the next village. A teacher woke up to find one of her students standing on the teacher's desk, barefoot, facing the wall, hands at her sides. The girl didn't speak. She didn't move until the teacher touched her shoulder. Then, in a voice she had never used before, the girl whispered, "The ground is softer when you forget." But she prefers it firm, so she can walk farther. No one understood what it meant, but that night, 3 other children across town were found standing in corners, whispering the same name, Nanthida. But no one in that town had ever heard of her, not once, not in books, not in stories, not in myth. And yet, they spoke her name perfectly, pronounced in the old dialect, like they'd known her all along. Molly saw it first online, a post from a woman in Chiang Rai. "My daughter keeps drawing this girl with open eyes and thread wrapped around her arms. She says the girl wants to come live in our house." Another from a man in Sukhothai. "I saw a girl standing in my garden last night. Long hair, no shoes, didn't speak, but when I blinked, she was closer." Arun searched deeper, and what he found chilled him to the bone. Dozens of posts, hundreds of comments, different cities, different people. Same girl, same silence, same thread. It had begun. She was no longer confined to the trees or the floorboards or the dream of one child. She was in the memory of strangers. She was becoming shared. And that was the final piece. Not vengeance, not rebirth, but presence. Arun tried to warn people. He called old friends, emailed scholars, messaged forums. Some ignored him. Some blocked him. Some listened. And those who listened, they started dreaming of her. The curse wasn't spreading by touch. It was spreading by awareness, by memory, by curiosity. Anyone who knew enough to ask had already let her in, because Nanthida was never meant to be buried.
She was meant to be carried. Lin no longer spoke like herself, but she wasn't fully gone. She still held Molly's hand. She still hummed sometimes, soft, eerie lullabies that Molly remembered singing to her when she was 3. But now, when Molly asked questions, Lin didn't answer. The house did. Through creaks, through symbols in the mirror, through red threads tied around doorknobs, always forming loops, always pointing outward, as if inviting others in. And then came the whispers from beyond, voicemails with silence and breathing, photos sent to phones showing rooms people never entered, emails with no content, only the subject line, "She watches." Molly broke down one morning, collapsed in the hallway, sobbing. "I can't hold her anymore. I can't raise a child who is no longer mine." Arun held her, but even as he did, he felt the truth. Lin wasn't theirs. She was hers, a vessel, a voice, a road on which Nanthida could walk farther than the grave. And then the visitors came, not from the government, not from the police, but from other towns, people who had dreamed of the thread, people who had seen her in glass, people who woke up standing in the middle of fields, unable to speak, eyes wide, hearts racing. They came in silence, knocking on the door, asking one question: "Where was she buried?" They didn't scream, they didn't cry, they just wanted to see. Molly asked one of them, a woman from Bangkok, why she had come. The woman smiled softly and said, "Because I heard her footsteps in my daughter's sleep. And I think she's already walking inside our walls." By week's end, 37 people had come to stand around the banana trees. They didn't speak to one another. They didn't explain themselves. They just stood, like roots, like anchors, like witnesses. The trees no longer bled because they no longer needed to. Their job was done. The 7th root had risen, and through it, so had she. Now she was carried in memory, in mirror, in mind. Lin stood at the edge of the crowd, staring out toward the road. She whispered something only Molly could hear. "She doesn't want to be found anymore, Mama. She wants to be followed."
It began with a mark, a crude shape scratched into the wooden door of an abandoned train station in Nakhon Phanom. No one paid it any attention until a street vendor noticed the same mark burned into a tree trunk 40 kilometers away. An eye, drawn with 7 strokes, surrounded by curved lines, banana leaves, and below it a word etched in faded red: "Done. Walk." Then the photos started appearing online. Some thought it was street art. Others called it a cult, but Arun knew the truth the moment he saw the first image. This wasn't vandalism. It was a direction, a path. And the symbols weren't random. They were connected. He printed every photo he could find, laid them out across the floor of the living room, now barren of furniture, candles flickering in every corner. Lin sat beside him, silently watching. Mali traced each symbol with a piece of chalk on the wall, each one slightly different, some drawn with charcoal, some with thread, some with blood. But the positioning mattered more than the style, because when they connected the dots, it made a spiral. Not inward, outward, like a seed growing away from its origin, like a girl walking farther. They laid the spiral over a map of Thailand, and the pattern emerged. Every mark sat near a border, between provinces, between villages, between cities. As if she was no longer haunting a place, she was outlining a territory. And once the spiral was complete, what would be inside it? One mark appeared on a hospital wall in Chiang Mai, another on a classroom whiteboard in Khon Kaen, drawn in red marker by a student who claimed not to remember doing it. One appeared on a website background, code inserted anonymously, forming the I in binary. Someone had uploaded her into the digital world. Now she didn't just travel by thread or thought. She traveled by signal, by screen, by scroll. And then came the sound, a frequency captured accidentally by a field researcher in Ubon Ratchathani, a low, steady pulse beneath the usual ambient noise. But when slowed down and reversed, it revealed something else, a whisper. One word, spoken in a dozen voices layered atop each other, all of them saying, Jam Dai Leo, I remember now. That same day, Arun found a new mark carved into the wooden post of their own front gate. He hadn't heard it being carved, hadn't seen who did it, but it was there, fresher than the others. And this one was different. Instead of 7 leaves, it had 8. A new petal, a new direction, a message. She's not walking in circles anymore. She's changing the shape of the land. Lin began drawing without pause. Her notebooks filled with overlapping spirals, marked with X's, I's, and looping lines of thread. Sometimes her fingers bled from pressing the pencil too hard. Sometimes she used charcoal. Sometimes she used her own hair. Arun took one of her drawings and compared it to the map. It matched, perfectly, down to a curve that passed through their village and kept going. She's not done, he whispered. She's mapping herself into the country. Not as a ghost, not as a story, as an infrastructure, a sacred pattern, a new form of presence. That night, Mali tried to burn one of the drawings. It wouldn't catch fire. Instead, the chalk lines glowed red, and the flame flickered backwards, not toward the paper, but away from it, like it feared what was drawn. Then the candle extinguished itself, and in the dark, they heard it again. Lin's voice and hers, merging. Maps aren't for finding, they're for remembering the way back, and I have been so far from myself. In the morning, a mark appeared on the window glass from the inside, a perfect spiral, drawn in condensation, still dripping. Arun whispered to Mali, voice hollow. She's not just haunting the living anymore. She's rewriting the world around them. One symbol at a time, one thread at a time, one step at a time. It started with a name. A woman in Surin, 38 years old, mother of 2, woke one morning and couldn't remember her own name. She remembered her children. She remembered her house. She remembered her dreams, one in particular, where a girl stood outside her bedroom door, fingers wrapped in red thread, whispering something too soft to hear. But when asked who she was, the woman replied, I don't know, but she said she'd remember for me. In the following days, more reports emerged. A man in Ayutthaya forgot the names of his siblings. A teenage girl in Pitsunulak forgot the alphabet. A nurse in Bangkok forgot her own face, screaming at her reflection, convinced it wasn't hers. Each of them had one thing in common. They had either seen the symbol, heard the whispers, or dreamt of a girl who stood completely still, yet somehow moved when you looked away. Molly kept a journal. She had to,
because she had started to forget simple things: the year of her wedding, her father's voice, the smell of her childhood home. Some memories came back after a few minutes. Others never did. She wrote everything down obsessively, but every morning, pages had vanished, torn out, burned, or replaced with a single phrase written in red ink. "Let go. I will carry it for you." Lynn no longer used her name, not out loud. When asked who she was, she smiled and answered, "I'm what's left behind when you forget." She wasn't being cryptic. She was being honest, because something, someone, was collecting the parts of people they left unattended. A gesture, a habit, a fear, a name. One by one, being gathered like loose threads, pulled slowly from the fabric of identity. Arun fought to hold on to himself. He repeated his full name every night before bed. He looked at old photos, whispered the names of his ancestors. He even tied a thread around his finger, not red, but white, to remind himself, "I am still me." But one night, he looked at Molly and couldn't remember her birthday, then her mother's name, then the name of the road they lived on. He panicked, tore through drawers looking for documents, maps, anything. But the labels were gone, every word erased. Only symbols remained: spirals, open eyes, curved lines like leaves in wind. The village had changed too. People stopped using names when they spoke. They used gestures, descriptions. The woman who lives near the tree, the boy who once cried during the monsoon, the man with the missing dog. As if language itself had begun to unravel, not by force, but by exchange. And in that silence, she spoke louder. Not through sound, through substitution. You didn't forget your name. She held it. You didn't forget your memories. She wore them. You didn't disappear. You became part of her. At the temple ruins north of the village, travelers found a wall freshly inscribed, though no one had been there in years. It read, "In the space where a name once lived, she blooms." Molly had a dream that night. She stood before a mirror, not her own. In it, she saw herself, and behind her, Lynn, and behind Lynn, the girl. But not as a shadow, not as a ghost, as a version of herself she didn't remember becoming. A version with no name, no mouth, just open eyes, and a red thread where the heart should be. She woke in tears. Arun was already sitting at the edge of the bed, hands on his face. He looked at her pale and broken. "Do you remember my name?" he asked. Molly opened her mouth and froze. The answer was there, but behind something, behind her, behind Nanthida. Lynn stood in the doorway, holding a piece of paper. On it were dozens of names, first names, full names, nicknames, some familiar, some foreign, some crossed out, some underlined. At the bottom she'd written, "The ones who let me in, the ones who didn't fight to be remembered." And just beneath that, in smaller handwriting, "It's okay, I'll remember for you." That night, the wind returned to the village, but it didn't carry dust or rain. It carried voices, faint echoes of people trying to say their own names. Some succeeded, most didn't. And in the stillness that followed, the girl who was buried standing stood taller, not above the earth, but within the space you once called I.
No one remembers when the house stopped being a house. There was no explosion, No collapse, no warning. It simply changed. Room by room, wall by wall, memory by memory, until nothing inside it belonged to the people who had once lived there, only to her. The floors no longer creaked beneath weight, but breathed beneath feet. The mirrors reflected not your body, but your absence. The doorways no longer led to other rooms. They led to versions of the same room, repeated over and over like a prayer forgotten halfway through. And in every version, she was there. Not walking, not moving, just standing, as if she had never truly left that pit in the ground, as if the house had grown around her, like roots from a seed that should never have been planted. Lynn no longer spoke. She no longer needed to. She understood the house now, how it listened, how it watched, how it recorded. She could stand in the hallway for hours, eyes open, lips still, and still have a conversation with the wood beneath her feet. Molly once tried to call out to her, but Lynn only turned her head, slowly, like a door creaking open in an abandoned church, and whispered, "She says your voice is beautiful, but it takes up space where others are trying to remember." Arun tried to leave once. He packed a bag, opened the door, stepped outside, but the road had changed. It was longer now, curving, spiraling, turning in on itself until every direction led back to the front porch, and every step forward became a step further in. The house had become a vessel, a cathedral of whispers, a mausoleum for the forgotten, a shell of memory where the living were only temporary residents. Sometimes visitors came, but they didn't knock. They stood outside, watched, and if the door opened, they walked in silently. They never walked back out. One room, the old kitchen, had become a gallery, not of photographs, but of names, etched into the walls, scrawled on a ceiling, carved into the floor. Names of people who had once remembered her, names of people who had tried to forget, and names of people who never knew her at all but spoke her name in sleep. In the center of the living room, a single chair remained, made of stitched red fabric, empty, always waiting. No one sat in it, because that was her seat, her throne, her altar. One night, Molly lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill. It flickered strangely, not from wind, but from breath. And in the flame, for just a moment, she saw it. The face of the girl, Nanthida, young, still, watching, but no longer angry, no longer hollow, just complete, like a statue that had finally been carved from every piece others had left behind. Lynn stood beside her and said quietly, "She's not inside the house anymore. The house is inside her. And we're lucky, because now we'll never be forgotten. We'll live in the place where memory sleeps with its eyes open." The next morning, the village map was redrawn, not by any hand, but by the marks that had appeared overnight. Symbols burned into the ground, thread tied across doorways, eyes painted on trees, names missing from gravestones, replaced by a single word, "You," which means still here. And the Jirasuk house, it still stands, but no one calls it by its name anymore. They call it something else, something softer, something reverent. They call it the house that watches,
And those who visited don't knock. They bow. They whisper her name with care. And when they leave, if they leave, they carry a small thread around their wrist, not as protection, but as permission to carry her further, to walk where she walks, to remember what others dared to forget, because she was buried standing so she could return walking. And now she never has to stop.